What I'm going to try to do, I mean, I'm here to actually attend the conference on the Global Alliance for Clean Cooks, which is a global effort to try and figure out how to educate people about the dangers of exposure to household and increasingly, at least in New Delhi, ambient air pollution. And so I'm happy to be sharing some of the work that I've done. That was the basis of my coming to India. So what I'm going to try to do is not scare people too much, but at least hope I can give you enough information to change attitude about, walking around with particulate matter on 380. That's scary to me because I know a lot about what that process does, to our body. And so what I'm going to do is try and give you an idea of what I do. I'm going to try and provide a little historical perspective because not all of this is new, yet we know a lot more. Look at some of the initial pilot studies that have demonstrated to us the challenges of living in a polluted city, and then talk about the concept of energy poverty and its implications on policy and health, and then talk about some of the work that I've done to at least understand the health implications of exposure to household air pollution, looking at a vulnerable population, pregnant women, and reflect on some of the efforts that's ongoing in India, which I think is actually great, to try and address this problem, and then talk about some strategies for future interventions. As I mentioned to you earlier, not all of this is new, and it should scare all of us because when you look at issues related to ambient air pollution, there are a lot of young people here who might not be aware that in the past we've had episodes that have changed our understanding and behavior related to ambient air pollution. But even though some of my work is focused on household air pollution, which is a major challenge for half of the world's population who are poor, we're in New Delhi, so I'm going to try and do both. Um, in, um, in the early 1930s and 40s, and probably the most striking was actually in England in 1952. Coal was the major source of energy for cooking and heating the homes then. And there was a serious inversion with fog that, just covered the whole of London for a week. That was around when Churchill was the prime minister then. That episode killed about 4,000 people that week. 4,000 people. Most people had heart attacks, some people had strokes, some people had airway disease, some people who had asthma had died of asthma, little children, everybody died. Okay? And such occurrence actually still happen even today. Luckily, those of you who are here, you are still living, so until it hits close to home, most people ignore some of these challenges. But they are here with us, especially in New Delhi, where it has the notorious, designation of being one of the most polluted cities in the world. It interchanges sometimes with Beijing. And during these episodes in the 50s, the particulate matter levels was higher than 1,000. Okay, 2 days ago when I got here, I was very happy to have opened the newspaper and I could see that on the front page. It told me that the level was going to be 389 parts per million. How many people know what the WHO standard is? 10 is aggressive, but we even allow for 35 is the WHO standard. But even for developing economies, we adjust and say 75 is still okay. So even at 389, it was on a nice day. It wasn't as hazy as it's always been around here. You know, just put that in context, you know, and I'm going to try and tell you from the biology part of it what this actually translates into from the health perspective. Not to scare you, but knowledge is power. Once you know, then you'll probably be one of the ambassadors to either influence from the policy, energy perspective to enlighten people, because that's why we do some of this research work. You know, in the United States, there was a study done in the 80s where they looked at 6 cities, okay, that involved a cohort of over 8,000 adults with a 14 to 16-year follow-up to try and see whether we could relate pollution in those cities to outcome in terms of developing cancer, developing stroke, developing heart attacks. And the result was predictable, just like it is today too, that particulate mortality, particulate levels, you know, correlate directly with mortality. And residents of the most polluted city predictably had the highest mortality, the risk of dying, either from cancer, stroke, or heart attack. And if you did smoke, it was even worse. And if you look at those cities, I don't know how many people are from Portage, Wisconsin, Topeka, Waterton, Harriman, St. Louis, and Steubenville, Ohio. And if you look at here, look at the inhaled particle level. Look at it. This is not high level. We're not talking about 389. Look at those levels. You know, the most polluted of them was Steubenville in Ohio. Okay, put this in context. 46, 48, being exposed to that. We have clean air in America, but people still complain because they haven't traveled enough to come to places like this, Nigeria, go to Beijing to see how polluted things get. So we're spoiled, and this is what it looks like in terms of the follow-up. And you can see that the most this is the probability of survival, okay? And you can see where is Steubenville. Look at the probability of survival is lowest in Steubenville. This is data over 8,000 people over time. So you see these are the cleanest cities, and these are the most polluted cities. So over time, predictably, people who actually lived in the polluted cities came down with the greatest mortality. They had the greatest mortality risk. And you can see here, does this work? You can see here, when you look at people who are current smokers and former smokers, these are the odds ratio, all-cause mortality. You can see it's about 100% worse. When you look at people who developed lung cancer, you can see the odds, 8 times. You know, if you didn't, if you were a former smoker, okay, and if you looked at the ratio between the least and the most polluted, consistent data. This is not new data. This is from 1993. So I don't know why we would think things would be different. Okay, when you look at cardiopulmonary disease, look at the odds of it. Okay, so I think periodically we need to really be reminded about the danger of exposure to ambient pollution, and more lately people are more sensitized to vulnerable populations who by virtue of not their fault, women and children, you know, who succumb to the high ambient levels indoors. Also, this is actually, I thought this would be relevant. My postdoctoral fellow is from India, and she did this study in India, which was published in 2011, to look at the impact of biomass use relative to people who actually cooked with LPG, which has been widely distributed in rural communities, to look at their predisposition to the development of hypertension and cardiovascular risk. So she looked at 480 premenopausal Indian women who lived at least 5K from an ambient source. And 5 kilometers is very important because with all the automobiles all over the place, if you live close to a highway, you're going to get a lot of the high dose of the diesel and the particulates that come from those exhausts. So this is looking at a relatively rural cohort of people who cooked with LPG and also biomass. And then they had used biomass for at least 5 years. And they looked at the particulate PM at the 2.5 and the 2.10 levels. And to put that in context for people, particulate matter at the 2.5 micron levels are small enough so that you can inhale them. They get down into the lungs, and what happens is it creates an inflammatory reaction that gets, all over the body, and it's very prothrombotic. What do I mean by prothrombotic? It sets off a cascade where the vessels, your arteries, actually clog up. If it happens to clog up your coronary arteries, you have a heart attack. If it clogs up the carotids, you have a stroke. And if it clogs up enough vessels over time, you have hardening of the vessels, you develop hypertension. So just imagine if you have underlying hypertension, you have underlying diabetes or underlying coronary artery disease, the outcome is going to be terrible because it's going to just shift you over. Anyway, what she focused on was looking at the levels, the pollutant levels, and you can see people who are cooking with LPG, look at that, relative to biomass cookers. And then look at, this is looking at concentration of PM 2.5, and I think on this time it's on PM 2.10. Okay, this is the more dangerous one. And you can see that consistently, whether you look at PM 2.5 or 2, it's the same relationship. And when you look at oxy-LDL, which is the lipid profile that actually predisposes to the development of atherosclerosis, clogging of the vessels, you can see the difference. Okay? If you cook with biomass over this time period, look at the difference. So there is significant benefit to being able to transition from the unclean fuel like biomass to a clean fuel. Okay, this is indoors. And look at the levels of the pollution that we're talking about. And then put it in the context of walking every day, where the PM 2.5 level is above 300 and 400. Okay, it should be very, and when I came 2 days ago, it was a good day. It's just imagine those days where you have the haze. It's terrible. And I'm hoping I can turn all of you to start, being part of a solution. What I thought this would be also make a point is, some of these things are cut in. This is looking at, this is a study that was done and published in the New England Journal of Medicine. I don't know how you couldn't do this kind of study in the US. So they looked at 20 men who had previously had a heart attack, okay, and decided to expose them to diesel-related particulate matter at 300, what we were talking about, similar to what you will get outside, and then filtered air. Okay, these are men who had had prior myocardial infarction. Okay, and then they did a stress test on them, either breathing this diesel exhaust versus fresh air. Okay, and for the non-doctors here or non-biology people, I know people have heard about stress tests, right? When you put people through a stress test, we're looking at the heart rate and we're looking on the EKG whether there is ST segment depression or elevation. Okay, and you can see here when people are exposed to filtered air, you see, these are people with coronary artery disease anyway. You can see some slight depression of the ST segment. But look at it when they're exposed to diesel. And what I want to just impress on you is the acute effect. The six city study was long-term, over 10, 14 years. This is an acute effect. Can you imagine going out and jogging and you have underlying coronary artery disease or diabetes or hypertension? This is really what is happening. Okay? So you're going to just fall down and die. If you live in Nigeria, they think it's witchcraft. Other parts of the world, they blame it on somebody else. But this is what we understand from the physiology. This is real. This is the acute impact. Testing regular people. So why does this pose such a cardiovascular risk? Okay, I'm going to show you. This is one of my colleagues who has an animal model. And what he's trying to do is expose these laboratory animals to filtered air. And I think air that they brought from Finland, clean air. All right? And what they did was exposed the two groups of animals. And then they sacrificed the animals to look at, I told you that exposure stimulates a system of inflammation that causes thrombogenesis, meaning that your blood vessels clog up. Looking at the animal studies, this is looking at, on this axis, this is bleeding time, okay? These are the control animals, and these are the animals that are exposed to particulate matter. Okay? When your blood is really thick, the bleeding time is reduced. So you can see that the bleeding time is reduced. Look at the clotting time. It clots much quicker than when you're exposed to clean air. And when you look at, partial thromboplastin, which is another way of looking at the clot, you can see. Okay? Again, confirming what I just showed you in people with coronary artery disease, because you have coronary spasm. It's thrombogenic. This is clots that happens in most of the vessels acutely. Okay, and if you look at this here, where the time it takes, they sacrificed those animals and looked at the time it actually took to have the occlusion of the vessels. Look at the time to the occlusion of the blood vessels. Striking. Okay, so we know, so all the people who say that we don't have enough evidence, that's not true. We know that these exposures are dangerous. Okay, and we keep doing and doing them. Hopefully there will be enough people here who know more about policy, about environment, to be part of change agents. These are published work. These are published work. Okay, so why is the exposure to dangerous in women and children? Who knows? Why are women and children more vulnerable than all of us? Pictures are worth 1,000 words, right? Poor people, whether it's in Nigeria, Bangladesh, India, anywhere, and that's about half of the world's population. They don't have access to electricity, but you have to take care of their family. They have to cook. This is what happens. And when those kids are little and can't go to school, where are they? They're on mom's back. That's right there with mom. And the incomplete combustion, when you cook with solid fuel, either kerosene or biomass, is you have pollutants, particulate matter, you have polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, you have nitrous dioxide, you have carbon monoxide. Okay, this is why women and children are most vulnerable. And they account for about 2/3 of the 4 million premature deaths that happen every year. 4 million premature deaths from household air pollution. And the most recent data from the Lancet Commission, when you look at indoor and outdoor, is actually like 9 million premature deaths every year. Preventable. So if you look at all environmental or even risk factors, malaria, HIV, all of those things, they don't come close to the mortality and the disability related to exposure to air pollution, both indoors and outdoors. And just to put India in context for you, in India, about 65% of the population cook with biomass, mostly in the rural setting. Okay, there are about 800 million in this category, and it accounts for 1.25 million deaths every year in India. And you can see all the other parts of the world where you have exposure. Look at China, over 1 million. Look at the number of people that are exposed. But India in particular, because I'm in New Delhi, it's important to highlight this and bring this a little closer to home. So it's a big challenge, especially in low to middle income countries where you have the concept of energy poverty. When you look at energy poverty, who are the people that are involved? Okay, look at where they are. Sub-Saharan Africa, look at India. And then there is a dichotomy between rural and urban settings. I mean, this is least developed countries of the world, and most of them happen to be in sub-Saharan Africa anyway. So if you live in a rural setting, you're not going to see any electricity, even in the urban setting. Okay, so just think about that. And then you look at the people who are relying on solid fuel or biomass for cooking. It shouldn't surprise us. It's the same group of people. So half of the world's population, over 3 billion people, they're cutting down trees. They're cooking with firewood. Okay? And all of these pollutants are getting into the air, contributing to the instability in our weather patterns. Okay, when you look at the issue of climate change or global warming, you know, with industrialization, a lot of those industries, they produce carbon dioxide. Half-life of carbon dioxide is about 200 years. There's nothing we can do about it. Okay? When you look at half of the world's population that cut down trees and cook with firewood, you know, they produce black carbon along with all the other pollutants. And the black carbon that stays up in the air, they have absorbed solar energy. They get deposited on all of the snow caps. That's why we're having a lot of this melting. A major contributor to it, in addition to the CO2 that we can't do anything about. But the good news with black carbon and biomass use is that the half-life is only 3 weeks. So there's actually something we can do about half of the world's population that don't have access to clean energy. If we can stop the deforestation, if we can stop the pollution by half of the world's population that must feed their family, we may have a chance. But the problem is we're not connecting the dots. You know, I'm sitting in Chicago, you know, you think it's a problem in Nigeria, you think it's a problem in India. When we have the hurricanes that come to Houston, you know, Battery Park in New York, we spend $8 billion, we fix it. Okay, but we don't ever think that we live on the same, in the same earth that there's something called the jet stream. It doesn't just stay here in Delhi, in New Delhi. It flows all the way back to America from everywhere. You know, if you were to spend $8 billion, which is what it costs, to fix Battery Park when Hurricane Sandy came, just think about all of the people that have no electricity, rural electrification. So that's why those of you who are here should figure out a way to be supportive of the Indian government, because what they're trying to do in terms of, changing and providing LPG, there are challenges, but their goals are very novel. The effort to try and get rural electrification in place, very, very important, to look at the vulnerable population. And in terms of the global energy, you go from here, and as you come here, these are the high-income countries. They cook with electricity, natural gas, ethanol with methanol, and poor people cook with dung, firewood, and all of those nasty stuff. So in focusing on the scope of the problem, I've said it so many times this evening. Okay, I think I put some India-specific stuff here so that we can put it in context. So I'm originally from Nigeria. I grew up there, went to medical school there, and I've gone back home to do some of these studies, because sometimes when studies are done in developed economies, people at home don't believe it. Okay, so this study was done in Nigeria for several reasons, to document how bad exposure to household pollution is. Number two, to choose a cohort of participants that people will have sensitivity towards, pregnant women, to look at the impact of exposure to unborn children and women. And the first study that I did was in a rural community. This is what it looks like. And in a lot of those places, there are no cross ventilation. They cook indoors. They keep their animals indoors. And one of the first things that we did was, I'm a pulmonary, I do asthma work, was trying to look at high school children and to try and relate the presence of biomass versus non-biomass cooking fuel in the home on the risk of developing asthma. And you can see here by looking at about 800 students who lived in homes with biomass and those without. You can see the wheezing, current wheezing. You can see that there's a significant difference between those who actually cook with biomass, meaning that exposure to biomass, the fuel that you cook with, increases the risk of actually developing an atopic disease such as asthma. Okay? And just to make sure that we go through this quickly, what we did was we looked at what women were cooking with and looked at particulate matter level 1 hour into peak of cooking, and then looked at carbon monoxide levels. Okay, this is at baseline. At baseline here, you can see the PM 2.5 level is still in the region of, this is the WHO standard. Okay, you can see that even at baseline, it even went as high as 100, showing you that the air circulation is unhealthy. For this room where we're in to be healthy, we need at least 6 to 8 air exchanges every hour. So for the baseline to be here, you can see that these are not homes that are well ventilated. And this is the same thing that you see all over the world for poor people. Okay, at the peak of cooking, this is 5,000 here. All right? So this is what people get exposed to when they're cooking and taking care of their families. And carbon monoxide level was in the region of 200 parts per million. I think you and I will probably be out cold, but over time, this is what people get exposed to. And as a result of this, I mean, what we did, I mean, I just show you is, after demonstrating this, then I invested in, through the American College of Chest Physicians, they gave me some money. I got some of these rocket stoves, which is an example of improved biomass stove. They're lined with ceramic, so they're supposed to cut the wood into smaller pieces than this. And because lined with ceramic, it heats to a higher level so that you're trying to get a near complete combustion. And as a result of that, there is less emission. But you can see that this was before, this was afterwards. So exposure to levels still in the 200 range, unacceptable, although it was very, very good in eliminating the carbon monoxide, which was good. Okay, in terms of exposure-related complaints, looking at both for the mothers, you can see that headaches, when you have carbon monoxide poisoning, you develop headaches. Runny nose, burning eyes, chest tightness, dry cough, difficulty breathing. Some of you that have ventured to run when you're in Delhi, this is when you are having that shortness of breath and say, why are my eyes burning? This is what you get. And this is before and after. So we know that some of these improved stoves, they actually work. But do they work to improve the indoor air quality to the extent that there won't be ongoing risk of health problems? No, they don't. And whether it's in the mother or on the children, we found the same thing. And this is also quite troubling. This is looking at pulmonary function testing. These are non-smoking women and children who are older than 6. To do pulmonary function, to look at moderate obstruction that you will see in asthmatics. 30% had significant obstruction in the airway. Okay, in the children too, look at them. Okay, so the chronic unmitigated exposure over time leads to obstructive lung disease. Okay, and so after seeing the residual effect of the particulate matter and the indoor air quality, what I wanted to do was actually look for a stove that could get the air quality to the level that would be safer for these women. And I stumbled on an ethanol stove because rich people, how many people have boats here? Okay, rich people, when they go on their boats, they cook with ethanol. It's ethanol that they use. So I stumbled on this and I got this nice ethanol, it's called a clean cook stove, you know, to do this intervention and picking pregnant women because most men have daughters, they have wives, they love their children, and I was hoping that the outcome of this study would help us to sort of influence policy to try and get into people's, you know, subconscious in terms of, you can do it in men, people don't pay attention, but when it involves women developing children, people think twice, even though they may be in government and don't care about their people. When it comes to women and children, I was hoping that that was going to be a masterful stroke. So we randomized some of these women who were cooking originally with kerosene and firewood stoves so if you were cooking with kerosene, we will randomize you into either ethanol or you continued with the kerosene. Firewood, we did the same thing. So we had a blended control group, okay, to try and see whether, and then the main research questions were this: to determine the relationship between HAP exposure during pregnancy and birth outcome, to look at whether the ethanol intervention will affect blood pressure, because hypertensive changes in pregnancy is a major source of eclampsia that may kill the woman and even the child. And we wanted to know whether the ethanol transition would actually reduce the exposure, and also with the participants use and adopt the ethanol stove. Because so many people have given all of these poor people stoves, they stack them. They stack those stoves because they don't usually perceive the benefit. They're not as, you know, understanding as I'm hoping many of you in this room. And the primary hypothesis that we wanted to test is right here. So we were going to measure particulate matter, polycyclic hydrocarbons, which is a carcinogenic, and carbon monoxide, to see that transitioning will reduce those outcomes. That was the a priori what we wanted to do. This was where we did this study. This is Ibadan in Nigeria. It's a mega city. It's one of those 10 million, and you can see the households. You see how close they are. You know, so you can imagine if you don't have energy poverty, there's a lot of generators that people use. So with cooking indoors and the generator from outside and the number of cars, you can see it's just like here, where you have automobiles and all of this. And then what we did was we randomized them in the first trimester. We did personal exposure monitoring for 72 hours in these women. We threw a GPS in there so that in those 72 hours, we were interested in knowing whether we could tell how much exposure was indoor versus how much was outdoors. And then we put a temperature probe, which is a stove use monitor on every stove in the household so that we could know which stove they were using to see, because if they didn't adopt the intervention stove, then the outcomes that we would find would be, not very good. We wanted to really know what stove they were using. And then we did ultrasound 6 times during the pregnancy in each so we could look at intrauterine. I'm not going to talk about all of those tonight for time. And then the pregnancy outcomes that we were interested in are this: the birth weight, whether they were able to get the pregnancy to term, miscarriages, stillbirth, neonatal deaths, and blood pressure changes. And then all the secondary stuff, which I won't bother you with. If I have time, I may want to just show you some of the work that observation in the placenta, because that is the most troubling of all of this. In terms of looking at the next generation, people walking around pregnant, to look at the impact of that exposure on the development of the baby. That is just unbelievable. So we ended up randomizing 162, 324 in this group. And then these were the exclusion, to try and exclude things that could lead to small for gestational babies or adverse pregnancy outcome, HIV, high-risk pregnancy, smoker in a home. And for those women who actually cooked for a profession, there was no way we were going to be able to reduce the exposure. So we excluded those women. And the randomization was actually good, because when you looked at both groups, you can see that there wasn't much difference. The only difference that's now here is the BMI in the control group was a little higher. Okay, so we felt very good that the randomization made the two groups quite comparable. This was really like, good news for us. The stove use monitor that I told you we put on all the stoves, when you turn on the stove, the temperature went up. So we could tell which stove people were using. So in the intervention group, you could see here that within 2 months of the study, households that actually had kerosene and ethanol, they stopped using the kerosene stove. You could say it was because we gave them the stove for free. We provided the ethanol for free. Okay? And it was a clean stove. Just think about that as a possible biased situation, but it was an important bias because that's what we wanted to see. And we could look at the other group, look at the kerosene group. So they were adopting the stoves that they were randomized to. So this is very important, and I'll show you what happened after the study when we weren't giving them the ethanol anymore, which is very important as we deal with issues around, stove stacking. So what's the relationship between HAP exposure, birth weight, and other pregnancy outcome? This is not published work. It's undergoing, final second review, but this is what we found, okay? The ethanol group babies were slightly bigger, about 88 grams, bigger than the kerosene and the firewood group. If you corrected for the BMI changes, this became significant, but I don't want to play statistics here. But what we've also found was that the women in the ethanol group were able to take their pregnancy to term more than the other group. If you look at the rates of preterm delivery, you can see that it was much higher in the kerosene and firewood group, and the rates of miscarriages, stillbirth, or neonatal deaths also significantly higher. Okay, so adverse pregnancy outcomes could be mitigated to a large extent by going to a cleaner fuel, in this case, ethanol, because the clean cook stove is a Tier 4 stove. And the Tier 4 rating just means that in terms of emissions, in terms of safety and all of that, that's what puts it in a Tier 4 level, along with electricity, biogas, and LPG. Okay? And then can it reduce the PM level? This is, you remember I told you that we used GPS. Approximately 70% of the exposure occurred in the homes, with 30% outdoors. So you can see the challenge that those of us who try to do intervention studies face, because nobody lives inside the home. You go out, and that's very relevant to what we're talking about here. Most of us here probably cook with gas at home, but you got to go out through that 380, I don't know how high it gets on those hazy days here. So put that in context and try and relate this to pregnant women too. Because the levels that we're talking here are not astronomical. When you look at, and we looked at 72-hour mean, we looked at 72-hour maximum, and we looked at time that in minutes that women spent with a PM level above 100. You can see here, this is trying to relate birth weight to exposure. You can see that there's an inverse relationship here. The higher the exposure, especially in the firewood cohort, the smaller the size of the babies. This is actually one thing that we couldn't have anticipated, that without doing anything, the intervention group is here in the light bar here. This is the control group. They came in 140, this is about 70 diastolic blood pressure, okay? And this is normal physiology, because when you get pregnant, all of the vessels, you have a lowered blood pressure. But look at them near delivery. So the women in the control group actually developed hypertension. And there was actually a significant 3.8 millimeter drop in diastolic blood pressure in the intervention group. And think about this, these are young women in the 28, 30-year-old. We didn't do any other intervention. They all came with normal blood pressure at entry. So if you look at it, 6.4% of the people in the control group developed hypertension at term, relative to 1.9 in the ethanol users. And when you looked at kerosene, kerosene was actually the major driver of the hypertensive changes that we see. The WHO has said nobody should cook with kerosene, but probably this is the first time that we've been able to show how bad kerosene is, as it relates to hypertension. And when you put this in the context of preeclampsia and hypertensive changes in pregnancy, this is a big deal. Exposure-related complaints such as headaches, shortness of breath, predictably. One thing we did from the ethics perspective is we actually provided both control and intervention group education on how to minimize their exposure. Because, we had enough evidence that this could be bad. So you can see that even the control group had a reduction in the exposure-related complaints. But when you look at the intervention group, you can see that there's even much further reduction in the exposure-related, indicating that we actually accomplished slightly improved improvement in indoor air quality. And then at the end of the study, about 81% of the women in the intervention group have adopted the ethanol stove. They're using their own money to buy ethanol. And the women in the control group, we gave them the stove. This stove cost about $65. So it's a really nice stove, and it doesn't smoke anymore. The efficiency, safety, and ease of use. They have not had to change the stove in 2 years. They would otherwise have had to change the kerosene stove a few times. The reduction in the smoke exposure made it a lot easier to have their children with them. And then the smoke-related complaints were much lower. And then finally, they felt they put them in a slightly higher socioeconomic. Look at that stove. It made them feel as if they were not at the bottom of the... this is very important for people who do behavior change in terms of, yes, we are focused on the pregnancy outcome, but this is what was important to the women. Okay, and we should learn from some of this, because as you give the LPG in the homes to these women, if they don't perceive some of these positive changes, if they're scared that it's going to explode and blow up, they're not going to use it. You know, so there's an ongoing need to continue to educate and to put this in context in terms of where we are. This is looking at the dose response curve. Most of the HAP-related issues are here, okay? And the question is, how far here can we get to start having significant health benefits? That's what this is all about with respect to all of these stoves, because outdoor pollution issues, we used to think they are here, but now in New Delhi, I don't think I'll be certain to say that it's here. This is looking at pneumonia risk or any health impact. With respect to our study, I think this is probably where we are. You know, we still haven't been able to push it down enough for it to be completely safe, because we're still dealing with outdoor pollution, and for those who are still stupid enough to smoke. So in terms of summarizing what we found, ethanol, clearly we've demonstrated that it reduced personal exposure, but we still have to face the challenge of ambient exposure. Cooking with kerosene and firewood adversely affected pregnancy outcome, and the stove intervention had health benefits in reducing blood pressure, in causing fewer pregnancy outcome, and the adoption of ethanol stove was very high. And in utero, I haven't shown you this. If I'm going to talk about some of the policy changes, not mine. This is from the Lancet Commission on Pollution and Health that was just published a few days ago. And this is actually very practical. Some of the things, and I want to put this in the context of some of the things that the Indian government is actually doing to make pollution prevention a high national priority and internationally, and to integrate it into country and city planning. That's what Indian government is trying to do, to distribute 80 million stoves to those rural households by 2020. And they're at about 30 million. I know there will be naysayers in terms of looking for some of the things that are not working well, but it's a major positive step. No country in the world is doing this, especially countries where they have a lot of disadvantaged populations. Mobilize and increase the focus of funding and international technical support to pollution control. At the presentation we had yesterday, there are a lot of people here doing a lot of modeling so that people can actually have information about exposure, so that once you know, then what do you do in terms of behavior modification so that you don't go out jogging on a day when PM level is about 500, as much as you would love to jog, because I showed you what will happen to your coronaries. Okay? And then to establish systems to monitor pollution and its effect on health. That is also ongoing here. Build multi-sectorial partnerships for pollution control. I'm a clinician. I need the policy, the environment, and the economist among you to look at how do we look for smart subsidies? How do you package some of this? How do you do policy that would influence behavior change? How do we think about the most vulnerable among us so that they're not polluting the air, contributing to climate change and environmental degradation, because they don't have any choice? So it's in our own best interest to make sure that we take care of those vulnerable populations, because they're half of the world's population, and it's a lot of people. And then integrate pollution mitigation into planning processes for non-communicable diseases, because we know that we've succeeded in eliminating most of the chronic communicable diseases. If you look in the next 15, 20 years, the highest cause of mortality are going to be in chronic non-communicable diseases: hypertension, stroke, cancers, respiratory diseases. And when you relate it to some of the problems that you get with pollution, it doesn't matter whether you're in a developed or a low-income setting. You're going to get the same thing. But the challenge is the disparity is just going to widen, because a lot of people who live in low-income settings, they don't have the healthcare access to be able to have the best care to mitigate or at least minimize the impact of some of these issues. And what I'm not talking about, and then to look at, do more research on pollution and pollution control. What I haven't talked about is some of what we also know that involves the sense of smell. How many people know how important the sense of smell is? You know, when you put that perfume on, you smell nice, you know. You know, when you are exposed to high levels, you know, as you inhale and it goes down to the lung, it also affects the nose, the loss of smell. We know from some of the work that's been done by some of our colleagues, the loss of smell is actually associated with increased 5-year mortality. So the moment you use your sense of smell, your chance of dying in 5 years is quite high. So we're trying to see, and some of these are related to some of this particulate matter. It contributes to some of the development of early cognitive deficit and dementia in people. So being able to have access to pollution level and being able to do something about it is going to be very, very important as we go forward. With respect to Indian global leadership in clean cooking, I guess there's nobody from the government here, but I think it's worth, you know, highlighting some of the things that they're doing that are good. The Ujwala scheme is a damn good idea. They should be encouraged. We should look for some of the challenges and figure out a way to fix them, so that explosion and cost issues, trying to look at how to give subsidies to those who really need them. Rich people don't need the subsidies. Direct them to the, although it's more difficult, once you give something to people, they don't want to give it up. So that was a strategic mistake, to make sure to give it to people people of means. Because once you give, it's difficult to take something away, but there should be effort to try and get smart subsidies so that people that they've given stoves to now are not pushed to go back to what they were cooking with. I think clean cooking solution for all by 2022 is also a smart idea, because they've started on also rural electrification. So if you can have rural electrification and you are agnostic to the kind of fuel, and you can use technology, adopt LPG, ethanol, you know, solar, whatever, to make sure that you have a broad option for people of different socioeconomic status. I think that's very good. And then creating markets for clean cooking stoves, because you're going to encourage entrepreneurs to be in that range. And I think I should just stop here, because it's almost 7 o'clock, so that I can take some questions. I'll come back again and tell you about the placenta, but I'll just tell you without showing you the slides. What we found was that, you know, when people get pregnant, you know, the body produces placenta growth factors, which leads to creation of new blood vessels. You know, so that's how the baby gets their nutrition, by diffusion from the maternal side. And close to the end of delivery, the body produces tyrosine kinases that sort of work against the new vessel formation, so that when people have their babies, they don't bleed out. What we did was we collected the placenta in the Nigerian women, and then collected placenta in the Chicago women who don't cook with firewood, with air quality that's 10 times better than in Nigeria. What we saw was disruption of the angiogenesis, so that in the Nigerian women who were able to take their pregnancy to term, there was no reduction because they were just fighting, just trying to produce more vessels so that there would be enough oxygen going to that baby. And then on the other level, when we looked at it histologically to stain for evidence of hypoxia in the placenta, we found that the more exposed Nigerian women, intervention, even our intervention group, better than the kerosene or fire group, you could see evidence of chronic hypoxia, low oxygen in the placenta of those babies that are developing relative to the women in Chicago. And just think about the implications of the growth and cognitive development of those children who grew up in a hypoxic environment. And those who had miscarriages and stillbirths are those women whose body couldn't compensate for the low oxygen and the exposure by increasing the angiogenesis. You know, so there's a lot we need to think about, not only about the health of the pregnant women, the young children, but the developing kids and the next generation. And I'm sure there are economists here. You can look at the impact of having your IQ knocked down a little bit on the productivity and the growth of the economy. So as we look at this, it's really a huge problem that all of us should pay attention to and not just ignore it. This kind of study is difficult to do without having a large group of people. So this is my team from Nigeria, from Chicago. We go back and forth. And the beauty of some of this work is you can look at what happens in Nigeria, where poor people have the same habits all over the world. It's just as relevant for Indian rural poor, anywhere you have poor people. So I'll stop here and take any questions that all of you may have. And I hope that you change your behavior when you have all of those high levels. Don't go jogging. Try and prevent yourself from just slumping and falling down when those levels are high.